let's talk about something incredible. Imagine a literary tradition so deep and so powerful that it lasts for 3,000 years. Now imagine that entire tradition getting torn down and completely rebuilt in less than a single lifetime. It sounds impossible, right? Well, that is the story of China's literary revolution, and we're about to see exactly how it all went down. For 3,000 years, Chinese literature was like a fortress. Seriously. It was built on this solid foundation of a very formal, very elite language, and it was all about looking back and respecting the ancient masters. It really seemed like a tradition that was just, built to last forever. And then, almost in the blink of an eye, that whole 3,000-year-old structure just crumbled. And in its place, something totally new, totally different began to grow: modern Chinese literature. So you have to ask, what happened? I mean, what kind of force could possibly be powerful enough to shatter a tradition that had stood strong for millennia? Well, the answer doesn't actually start in a library or a study. It starts on the battlefield and in the collapsing halls of power. The push for a new kind of literature, it turns out, came from a nation that was in a deep, deep crisis. Just look at this period. The late 1800s and early 1900s were just one catastrophe after another for China. There were humiliating defeats in war, a civil war that caused unbelievable devastation, and then the final blow: the collapse of the entire imperial dynasty. For thinkers at the time, the message was painfully clear. The old ways, and that includes the ancient literature that was so central to their culture, had totally failed them. And here's one of the biggest cracks in that old foundation: the end of the imperial examination system. For centuries, this was everything. It was the main path to power and prestige. If you could master the classical literary texts, you could become a powerful government official. So when this system was abolished in 1905, that crucial link between knowing old literature and having real-world power was just severed. All of a sudden, the central pillar holding up the entire classical literary world was kicked out from under it. So, with their own traditions failing, Chinese intellectuals started a desperate search for new answers. And where did they look? They started looking west, which brought in this absolute flood of new ideas, mostly through the work of translators. You can see how these new ideas started to seep in by looking at two really fascinating figures. First, you have Yan Fu. He translated Western philosophy and science into the most elegant, beautiful classical Chinese. Then you have this guy Lin Shu, and this is amazing. He adapted over 170 Western novels without knowing a single foreign language. He had people tell him the plots. And here's the real irony: they were both using the old classical style to introduce the very ideas that would end up destroying it. Now, these ideas didn't just stay as abstract concepts on a page. They lit a fire. They sparked this incredible wave of experimentation all across the country. Writers started playing around, trying to create new kinds of prose, new kinds of poetry, and new kinds of drama. They were essentially writing the first drafts of a modern literature. In fiction, for example, the realistic novel really started to take hold. Works like The Travels of Lao Kan were absolutely revolutionary. Why? Because they used everyday language, the language people actually spoke on the street, to talk about huge, urgent problems like government corruption. For the very first time, literature was talking directly about the problems of the present, not just the glories of the past. And it wasn't just novels. Poetry, which was maybe the most formal and rule-bound of all the arts, went through its own revolution. Poets just turned away from the ancient models. Instead, they found inspiration in things like folk songs and their own modern personal experiences. These new-style poems used simple language to talk about contemporary life. It was such a profound shift that one major reformer flat-out called it the revolution in Chinese poetry. Even the theater was completely transformed. For centuries, Chinese theater was this world of stylized opera, with poetic, sung dialogue. But then, influenced by Western theater, a totally new form pops up: spoken drama. Instead of singing, actors just talked, using realistic, everyday speech. And they often tackled modern social issues. Fun fact, one of the very first of these new plays was an adaptation of Uncle Tom's Cabin. So you can feel all these different experiments bubbling up, but they were all building towards one single explosive moment. Around 1915, this idea of literary reform stopped being a quiet little experiment. It became a loud, passionate, and very deliberate revolution. This was called the New Culture Movement. And its leaders believed that to save China, they had to rebuild its culture from the ground up. Their big ideas were science and democracy, but they saw a third pillar that was just as important, a revolution in language. Their argument was pretty simple. You can't build a modern nation with an ancient, inaccessible language that most people can't understand. And this slide really gets to the heart of the whole conflict. The reformers basically argued that the old classical style was a dead language. It was for a tiny elite, it was incredibly complex, and it was always looking to the past. They said that to build a modern, democratic nation, you needed a living language, a vernacular style that was direct, forward-looking, and accessible to everybody. Then, in 1919, this intellectual debate just exploded into a massive social movement. This was the May 4th movement. Thousands of students poured into the streets. They were protesting foreign domination, sure, but they were also demanding huge cultural changes. They carried the ideas of the new culture movement with them, turning the call for a new literature into a national cause. So, after this half-century of crisis, translation, experimentation, and protest, it all finally came together. It all culminated in a single work of art, a short story that would become the definitive landmark of this brand new era. Just a year before those big protests, a writer named Liu Shun published a short story called Diary of a Madman. And for those who read it, it was immediately clear that this was something completely new. It was a definitive, total break from thousands of years of literary history. This one story was basically the entire revolution in miniature. First, it was written entirely in the new vernacular language. Check. It used a first-person narrator, which was a very Western form. Check. It delivered a blistering critique of traditional culture. Check. And it was published in New Youth, the most important journal of the whole reform movement. It was just the perfect storm, putting everything the reformers had been fighting for into one single unforgettable work of art. And with that, the literary revolution was pretty much complete. Literature was no longer just a refined hobby for an elite class obsessed with the past. It had been reforged into a powerful, modern tool, a blunt instrument for critiquing society, for inspiring political action, and for trying to build a new China.